So without wasting time, let us get into the discourse. So it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Rahimatsah Amat. So Dr. Rahimatsah is the fellow of the Academy of Sciences Malaysia. He obtained his doctorate in protected areas planning and management from University Technology Malaysia and is attached with Sabah Environmental Trust since 2013. So currently, he is the regional coordinator for Asia for the Transboundary Conservation Specialist Group and a member of the advisory group for UK Global Challenges Research Fund on Blue Communities Project in Southeast Asia. At the national level, Dr. Rahimatsah is the chairperson for the Academy of Sciences Malaysia and a member of the Finance and Investment Committee of Sabah Parks. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Rahimatsah to continue to moderate this session for today.
Thank you, Sufyan. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A very good afternoon. And certainly for our distinguished speaker, a very good morning. It's an early morning. I hope you have a bright weather there. I would like to introduce Professor Melanie Austen here, who is a professor of Oceans and Society at the University of Plymouth, UK. She has been involved in interdisciplinary marine research on large national and international interdisciplinary research teams, and currently lead the collaborative GCRF Blue Communities project across 4 Southeast Asia countries and the UK. I believe that her paper will touch on the Blue Community project in this region. She has served in various UK government advisory roles, example, currently as a member of the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, and previously its Natural Capital Committee as chief scientist to its Marine Management Organization. She is chair of the partnerships of the UNESCO Biosphere Reserve in North Devon, UK. With that, Mel, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rahim, and thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you for inviting me to talk today. It's a real privilege. I'm going to try and share my screen now so that I can move into the presentation that I've prepared. Hopefully that's going to be working now. Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about interdisciplinary research, and this is something I'm really quite passionate about, the importance of. And if I move to my next slide, I want to start to explain why I think interdisciplinary research is so important. As Dr. Rahim said, I've been involved in natural capital and ecosystem services research for some time, and particularly on the marine side. But there's an overarching framework, and this is one example of it, the cascade, where we look at ecosystems and their structure and the processes and the functions that they do, just as normal ecology. But those structures and functions provide services which we are able to use if we wish to do so to create benefits for human beings. And some of those benefits have economic value, social value, health value, well-being value. And this is the critical thing about ecosystems, is this cascade from what they do just naturally to what human beings extract. But you can see here there are also feedbacks. The more we extract, the more we use. We need to have governance and management and restoration, because we can damage the systems, as we well know. Now, I've inserted underneath the ecosystems and biodiversity box the text natural capital assets. And natural capital is a strange way of talking about biodiversity, tropical biodiversity, any biodiversity really, because it starts to put us rather firmly into the language of banking and sort of investment and things like this. So why natural capital? Because it's a way of communicating with the wider public, with the managers, with people who need to understand that biodiversity and ecosystem services and ecosystem functioning is really important for people, and it's largely been kept outside of the normal accounting systems. And over the last sort of, probably 10, 20 years, but particularly I think in the last 5 years, there's an acceleration of consideration that natural capital shouldn't be considered as something that we just take for granted, but should be included in national accounting systems so that we understand what we're losing and what we're gaining when we degrade our biodiversity and its ecosystems functioning. Natural capital is part of different capitals. There's 5 capitals: social capital, human capital, financial capital, and manufactured capital. So it's the language of the investors, but it's the bit that also makes them sit up and think about what we do to our systems. And as we start to bring in this human dimension, then we start to think about different disciplines. Now, I know that there's been a talk on this series about what biodiversity provides and why it's important for people. So I'm just going to skip over this very quickly. But we have a whole bunch of habitats of biodiversity, and they provide ecosystem services. For example, food, or just somewhere that's a nursery ground for food or for other important species. For building materials, for charcoal, for flood and storm protection from, through mangroves and through seagrasses and through coral reefs. They dampen the wave action, they regulate some of the storm damage. The marine environment cleanses wastewater because a lot of our waste ends up in the marine environment. And the natural processes, the bacterial degradation, breaks down some of that wastewater and runoff, and it protects some of the nearby sensitive habitats. And these marine environments facilitate leisure, recreation, and tourism, some of which is just good for the health and well-being of the people who live at the coast, but also provides income and livelihoods through the recreation and tourism. Perhaps also just as importantly, but not often thought about, particularly in sort of my country, is the maintenance of spiritual and cultural values, the importance of these places to people's culture and spiritual happiness and just well-being. So we can also think of this in a summary here. We have the habitats, the ecosystem services they provide, and the societal benefits, and some examples of that from different habitats, from mangroves, which provide nursery habitat, which ultimately provides fish to eat. The sand has lots of organisms in it which do waste processing, providing clean seas where it's safe to go and bathe or to have leisure and recreation. The coral reefs and the seagrass beds that provide carbon burial and carbon cycling, and therefore lead to a healthy climate. But as we use these different services, we end up with trade-offs and things that we have to consider. On the one hand, we may be able to take fish or use it as a waste dump in the marine environment, but there are trade-offs if we do so. And here is an example of a photographic kind of contrast between what some areas of Tun Mustafa Submarine Park look like, where there's litter, there's waste, there's people who are trying to make a living from fishing, and at the same time, the beautiful environment under the water, the coral reefs, which are doing regulating services, looking after the carbon, supporting some of the fisheries, and also an attraction for tourism and recreation and leisure, and hence more livelihoods supporting. So our seas and coasts are really important for supporting livelihoods, for the food security, for the health and well-being of the coastal communities. Yet there's increasing conflict between users. More and more people are living at the coast, living at the sea. There's a massive increase in population at the coastal fringe. And there are risks associated with expanded or new uses, such as aquaculture, such as renewable energy, such as seaweed culture, and increasing ways of using the environment, or even just increasing tourism, which was happening pre-COVID and will increase as we move out of the epidemic. We have fragile ecosystems, particularly in the tropics, which need protection, and climate change impacts happening all the time that we need to consider. So we actually really need to improve the integrated management of the marine and coastal environments. And we believe that that's around implementing marine planning throughout Southeast Asia. This isn't a new concept. For example, PEMCES, which is Partnership for the Environmental Management of the Seas of Southeast Asia, even back in 2017, I think, said that marine planning was required through Southeast Asia. And this is a process that brings together multiple users of the ocean. It helps to determine where each economic sector can actually act to exploit natural resources. And it thinks and considers the distribution of the marine resources, the trade-offs between sectors. You can't necessarily have fisheries and tourism happening in exactly the same place. So how do you share that space? How do you do that equitably and maximizing livelihoods and benefits? And what are the economic, ecological, and social impacts of different activities that need to be balanced? So often marine planning is around creating spatial plans of where activities can happen, but considering all of these different trade-offs. So with this in mind, 3 years ago, I was privileged to win funding for a project called Blue Communities, which was funded from the Global Challenges Research Fund in the UK. And our overarching aim was to build capability for marine planning in Southeast Asia, because we really do believe that if we can manage marine ecosystems well, they will help to support livelihood, food security, well-being, and health of the people who live at the coast. And people really are at the center of this work and these ecosystems. And as you start to think about people, then you start to realize that we can't just look at natural science as the discipline that we address marine biodiversity with, whether it be in the tropics or in temperate waters or even in Arctic waters. People are part of the ecosystem, they exploit the ecosystem, they're dependent upon it. And we need to manage their activities so that we can maintain and sustainably keep the ecosystems going in harmony and sustainably. So we're doing this work in 3 UNESCO biosphere reserves in Vietnam, in the Philippines, and in Indonesia, and also in Sabah Marine Parks in Malaysia, because we want to compare and contrast. And we also want to build capability to think about marine planning and to think about marine systems in this holistic way. So the Universities of Plymouth, Exeter, and Plymouth Marine Laboratory have been working with Hanoi National University of Education, with the University of Malaya, Universitas Nacional, and the Western Philippines University in Palawan, as well as 3 NGO organizations. And we've really come together to build research capability, both in Southeast Asia, but also actually in the UK, amongst the UK academic partners, to think about how we build a supportive base, grow the capabilities of the people and of the institutions, create applications and tools that can be used. But considering particularly in Southeast Asia, how better marine management can help to address some of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And although actually anything to do with marine environments addresses most, if not all, of the Sustainable Development Goals, we highlight here poverty, hunger, health and well-being, and of course, life below water. So within Blue Communities, we have a lot of different projects that initially looked to particularly many of our partners in Southeast Asia, like individual projects sort of stand alone. They're different disciplinary things. So evidence synthesis is about doing really good synthesis of evidence through literature review, very careful systematic review. In this case, we were looking at health and well-being benefits from better management of the marine environment. And what was the evidence base for that? We've created a big map of what the evidence base looks like. There's been governance, critical analysis of the marine planning model applications. How has marine planning, marine governance worked in our different case studies? And that's linked closely with principles and approaches to decision making in the bottom left-hand corner. How can we think about trade-offs? Not just what's happened in the past, but how can we build on this to do better trade-off analysis in the future? Ecosystem services and values are a huge part of the work that we've been doing, and they've been quite dependent on habitat mapping using Earth observation approaches. There's been a marine renewable energy section in the work, and of course, ecosystem services trade-offs. Something that's quite unique to Blue Communities is we've looked at the well-being benefits and risks of coastal living. What are the health benefits of living at the marine environment and in a coastal environment, and what are the risks as well? There's also been some work on small-scale coastal tuna fisheries management, which has particularly been undertaken in Indonesia. I won't be talking very much about that. But there's quite a lot of synthesis. Another piece of work is looking at scenarios of changes. What's going to happen in the future? Both from the scientific perspective, what do we know from really sophisticated models, but also what do we know from what people think the future looks like and what they want the future to look like, the systematic scenario planning. And bringing this together to help people understand the ecosystem level policy and management options. So as I say, initially, these all look like quite isolated research projects, but they do come together, as you'll see. In the project, there's been a lot of engagement with people, with stakeholders, with other scientists, with managers, with policymakers, with the public. And we've had a lot of learning and exchange between the partners and between the stakeholders. We're sharing the lessons learned, and gradually we've scaled up. So what has become, we've moved from just doing these in the different case studies to comparing and contrasting across case studies, working together, seeing what works in one case study, and then using that to develop another case study and the approaches there. And that was really important as we build this capability, that we have to learn from each other and work with each other. Particularly, we had 5 challenges. How do we promote sustainable harvesting? How do we help prepare for climate change? How do we promote good health in the coastal communities? What are the opportunities for growth of their livelihoods, the economic situation for people living at the coast? And how can we help to co-develop and implement marine planning for those who are involved in marine regulation and management? So I'm going to skip through here some very quick examples of some of our work, just to give you a flavor of the kind of work that we've been doing. So there's been a big piece on governance analysis, and the example here is in Vietnam, working with different stakeholders, understanding how the initiation and implementation of the Cù Lao Cham Marine Protected Area evolved. Who were the key stakeholders? What were their relationships? What were the influences that were involved? Because if we can understand how we came to the situation now, we can look forward to the trade-offs about better management in the future. And similar work has been done in Indonesia and in the other 2 case studies, interviewing people, talking to them, coding the kind of messages they're saying. So this is qualitative, sort of semi-qualitative analysis. What are the key words? What are the key themes that come up? So very much social science to inform marine biodiversity management, bringing the different disciplines together. By understanding the stakeholders and by understanding the marine environment in Indonesia, they've been able to help with looking at tourism development and planning around the marine environment. Ecosystem services and trade-offs. Obviously, this is a big one for me because it's my particular subject area. But there's been a huge literature review looking at the different ecosystem services across tropical habitats, and that's been published in a paper recently. And when I share this presentation afterwards, I will put in a link to the publication that has come out recently, summarizing the different services, the different habitats, which ones are important for which services. We're currently developing activities pressures matrices to understand what activities go on in tropical environments and what the pressures are that they create, which habitats are sensitive to those pressures. And then further mapping the different habitats in the case studies, the different activities that are going on, towards providing some tools and information towards better management. So here we've brought Earth observation data into understanding ecosystem services by generating maps using Earth observations data, validating those on the ground through field services, surveys, and talking with the local experts and stakeholders, and then revising those habitat maps. We've also used aquaculture, used Earth observation to get somewhere really specific in understanding aquaculture sites. And the example here is in Tai Bay in the Philippines. So remote sensing shows that using radar, satellite, surface aperture radar remote sensing, shows different highlight areas and different structures in the water. And these are actually fish corrals or seaweed farms. So we can use the Earth observation to pinpoint the proliferation of really, really small scale, but actually burgeoning aquaculture facilities, which helps people to understand where things are developing and what needs to be managed. We're also working with the stakeholders to understand what's going on and where. So here is some data from VC Lim, originally in the University of Malaya, mapping where people are undertaking fishing, the different habitats that the local stakeholders and fishermen and managers, where people think that food is being caught, fish are being caught, what type of fishing, what type of habitats exist. It's really important to get local involvement in this, because often we can't go out and just sample every single habitat, much though we would love to. So getting local knowledge to support this work. Also linking activities and pressure, identifying what types of pressures are related specifically here to fishing activity. What sort of pressures does it create to the different marine environments? And here we're particularly looking at seabed pressures. And then we've looked further at which habitats these pressures predominantly occur within. Is it mangroves? Is it coral reefs, etc.? Then thinking about how we map those onto activity maps and create pressure layers. So basically creating a series of maps of different case study areas that will help inform managers and regulators, people who have to think about the future and where things can happen and guide where things should happen by understanding what's actually out there based on both satellite remote sensing, some science to validate that, as well as the local stakeholder understanding, as well as the best understanding from the literature. We also looked at well-being, benefits and risks of coastal living, trying to understand what people think about the marine environment, what's affecting the marine environment, their interactions with the marine environment, how it may be helping their health and well-being. And actually, what is their health and well-being at the moment? So in the 4 case studies, there's been a survey, face-to-face interviews, trying to elicit this sort of information. And sneaked into there were some questions which also related to the ecosystem services and well-being. So we start to have a collaboration between the people who are looking at health benefits and the people who need to understand more about the ecosystems, the functions they do, and what's important to people, and also what people's perceptions are of the environments and how they've degraded. So we have a huge amount of information from these surveys. I think there's in the region of 200 surveys with different people per case study areas. We're looking at what the situation is within the case studies, as well as across the case studies. What are the common messages across the case studies? So that's work in progress at the moment, but it's really exciting. More sort of fundamental science, using mathematical models of the future under climate change, sophisticated models which bring hydrodynamics, mapping, and modeling of the biogeochemistry. Some very large models were created. These are used to underpin our understanding of what the impacts of climate change might be on fisheries in the future, on different species of fish, the value of the abundance and biomass of potential catch. So we're able to model what might happen for 90 different species under different scenarios of climate and of fishing pressure. And this has been created and made publicly available both to our partners, but also is being made available as data online, freely available. And I'm just going to give you some examples of how our partners are using some of this underlying biogeochemistry and climate data to look at the vulnerability of MPAs, marine protected areas, to climate change, the distribution of pearl species for pearl farming and the implications for pearl farming. And most recently, there's been inquiries about from some of the managers in Palawan about the implications of climate change for the migration and expansion of saltwater crocodile populations in Palawan. In Indonesia, they're considering using this data to understand where the potential fishing grounds might be for tuna species in the future, what the distribution of giant wrasse might be, possibilities for grouper farming, and the vulnerability of coastal ecosystems to climate change in the future. Another piece of work has been thinking about how do we work with the stakeholders to understand what the future might bring and what the future people want is. And here's just an example where in Palawan, where people have talked with the local communities about what are the kind of problems, what are the kind of issues, what do people want in the future, building the Western Philippines University team capacity to lead and facilitate workshops with the stakeholders, to synthesize the information they've learned, to think about the scenarios and the narratives, but also to use creative representation to understand these. And this was embarked on here with students in local high schools, trying to use creative art to demonstrate the scenarios of the future and build the scenarios of the future that they wanted to see and the ones that they were concerned about might happen in the future. Big piece of work going on here, so I'm just touching on it, but I'm also going to just touch on some of the summary messages from that. So how we talk about the future matters when we're talking to coastal communities, thinking about people's emotions, what the solutions are that they might see, and the local relevance. Different people in different regions have different perceptions and different needs in terms of communications. Whilst we have models and an understanding of the future from the models, actually we've compared those models with people's actual perceptions of what they think the degradation has been in the past versus what they think might happen in the future. They don't always match in terms of what the science tells us and what people's perceptions are. But these perceptions are what actually influences behavior, even more sometimes than the science does, or in fact often more than the science does. It's people's perceptions that influences the behavior of coastal communities, but also some of the stakeholder managers. So it's really important that if we want to communicate the science, we have to think about effective communication to support behavior change. We need to find out how people think about the future of their local ecosystems, and at the same time encourage people to think about the future and the future of the local systems. That way we get to behavior change and also help them to start thinking about the science understanding that can help support where they want to go to. So I've talked about a lot of different strands of blue communities, and one of our partners, Dr. Hong Jing, started realizing, fairly early on in the project that there were an awful lot more connections between these isolated projects, data flowing from one place to another, ideas, thoughts, sharing questions in the surveys, work feeding from one place to another in all of these different projects. The interconnections are huge. And as you start to work across different disciplines, you realize how much you can gain from doing so and getting a much more holistic picture of marine systems, how they work, how they can be managed better, and how we can improve the situation for management going forward in all of those areas that I talked about in blue communities. So in summary, interdisciplinary research is important, but it does require multiple disciplines working together. Some training. It's not something that's instinctive for a lot of researchers to work across the disciplines. Sometimes it's a different language. People talk in different ways. Qualitative data, quantitative data. Qualitative data is a very weird term for many natural and physical scientists. But sometimes the hard data approach and the rigid adherence to quantitative data seems very foreign to a lot of social scientists and the way they approach data when they're talking with publics, with people. Stakeholder engagement is crucially important if we are to better manage marine resources, and stakeholder engagement is something that we need to borrow, particularly if we're natural scientists, we need to understand how best to do that. And social scientists can really help in this, as can health scientists. This kind of working requires an iterative approach. We have to keep talking to each other, understanding what data we have, what understanding we have, and working together. Integration and synthesis has been really important to Blue communities across the different disciplinary projects, but also increasingly across the different case study examples, because we can learn from each other and we can build a much bigger understanding by doing so. So I hope I've given you a flavor of what interdisciplinary research looks like when we're addressing sustainable use of tropical marine resources. And I'd be really happy to take some questions now if there are any from this. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Mel. Fantastic. I think I would give a little time to the participants to raise some questions, but I think normally they are very cool. You need an icebreaker. So let me start with the icebreaker. You provide some scenarios here for future in which the way to move forward, examples about the issues and concerns that you brought up in the beginning. Now, as a leader of the large initiative here across different countries, how difficult it is to coordinate this interdisciplinary initiative across different disciplines during this pandemic across different countries. I mean, I believe that the pandemic was never in the picture when the project was designed, but along the way, bang, comes in. How do you conduct adaptive management to address this?
Okay, that's a great question. There's actually a couple of things in there. I'm going to start with two questions in there. One is, how do you do interdisciplinary research across large areas? You have to have some very enthusiastic people, and you have to have a lot of conversations, a lot of discussion, because sometimes people really don't quite understand where different scientists don't understand where each other's coming from. They don't understand where the stakeholders are coming from. The public may have a very different view from what the scientists think. Everybody has different understanding of the system, but actually, the more you talk to each other, the more you realize that everybody has a valid view of the system and an important view of the system. And I think that's something that grew very rapidly as the project developed. I think the more the scientists got involved in talking to the stakeholders and the public in situ in the coastal communities, the more they valued that stakeholder view, that view and that understanding. They're as much the experts as the different disciplines. But that's built on conversations, discussions, workshops, talking to people. And you're absolutely right. The COVID pandemic has devastated that. In Blue communities, we were exceptionally lucky that we've had 2 years of talking to each other before we then couldn't talk to each other apart from virtually like this. And I think we're very fortunate that we've been able to build on a very, very fundamental basis that we'd built up in those 2 years. And it is much harder to do this remotely. But I think during the pandemic, we've learned that actually talking in this way across webinars, across Zoom, across the different virtual media does work. It's easier when you know each other, but it still works even if you don't know each other. You can still use these kinds of media. And we've become inventive. So where we would have had focal groups talking to each other, and you've seen lots of pictures where people have gone and talked. And I think there's been a bit of kind of, right, we've got a quick period now where the movement control order has not been in place. So we'll go and talk to our stakeholders now and then come back. So there's been a little bit of that. There's also been adaptation using telephones, using phones and having phone interviews. So where some of our partner institutions are a long way away, University of Malaya is a long way away from Sabah. So they've employed people in Sabah to do some more of that discussion and focal group and talking to people. having some of the tools like remote sensing, you can use those from anywhere in the world, thank goodness. Modeling you can do from anywhere in the world, thank goodness. It has been difficult to do some of the validation, the field work, particularly in the field for the biodiversity. But I think people find their ways around this, and people are very adaptive. They find solutions, and that includes research communities as well.
Yes, great. Now there are questions from the floor that I would like to pick it up here for you. The first one is, how do you promote interdisciplinary discussions? I believe you must have mentioned it, but for the benefit of the person who posed these questions, maybe in a simple line, how do you promote them?
Okay, there's various things. I mean, initially we had, for example, in Blue communities, everybody presented what work they wanted to do. So each of those projects presented the work, and then we talked about where were the overlaps and what were the things that would bring people together. That worked reasonably well in small tables, small groups, having discussions, very focused discussions, about different questions and guiding those discussions. Another one that worked really well was actually creating a kind of game, which has actually been developed further by the University of Exeter team, a trade-offs game, where they actually said, okay, here we have a coastal island, an imaginary island, and it has a fishing population, it has 2 new hotels, there are plans to develop 2 more new hotels, but these will be conducting leisure and recreation activities, particularly scuba diving and sailing and swimming, right on the coral reefs where people have been doing handline fishing for years and years and years. How do we balance the different needs of the different people? And we actually did role playing. I'm a fisherman and my livelihood is about to be affected, or I'm a developer for the hotel and I have a view, or I'm somebody who's going to be working in that hotel and I have a view. And we did a bit of role playing like that. And that's another way of helping people to understand different perspectives, including the research scientists, maybe making a social scientist into a biodiversity scientist who's an ecologist, and an ecologist into a social scientist, and getting them to role play each other. So that's another kind of fun way of doing things that we work quite well actually initially, and is being developed further as a tool for management.
Now, I think there is a question from Vinoteni. Are you around to, you could ask the question directly to Prof Melanie, please. You may unmute yourself if you like to.
Hi, Prof Austen. I'm Vino from Academy of Sciences, Malaysia. So I have a question. So, throughout your experience and your research, what do you find as the biggest threat for sustaining the resources, the marine resources in the tropics?
I think it's a really good question, because I actually do think there are lots of threats. And okay, so if we just take it from the tropical resources, if we look at it from the biodiversity perspective, let's go straight to that. The biggest threat to me feels like climate change. The sort of, obviously the global warming, the change in the biogeochemistry, the fundamental changes that are going to happen to the ecosystem through climate change. Biodiversity loss is going to be accelerated through climate change. And at the same time, I think the other threat is clearly uncontrolled fisheries, unsustainable fisheries. To me, those are the 2 key complementary pressures on tropical marine resources. And we're in a crisis at the moment, as we know, around climate change. We know that particularly in the tropics, areas are going to get warmer. Areas are what that actually changes is the biogeochemistry, and that's the fundamental thing that we see from the modelling. The nutrients will move into different places, and the biodiversity will effectively, it may be able to follow that. Different fish may be able to follow where the nutrients are, where the plankton is, and they may not. And we know the effects on coral reefs. We can see that already. So that's probably the biggest one for me. Having said that, some of the models that were produced on the fisheries by colleagues Sabrine Saley and Susan Kay at Plymouth Marine Laboratory have actually shown that in some areas there are going to be increases in fish abundance and fish biomass, but in others there are going to be decreases. So there's going to be winners and losers from the people perspective, but fundamentally the ecosystems are going to change and are changing. And that's, for me, the biggest concern for sustainability. And sustainability is how we adapt to that, so that how, we continue, we will continue to exploit marine resources, fisheries, shellfish, etc. And can we do that sustainably? We don't even do that particularly well now. And under climate change, when we're not quite sure where everything is going to be anyway, because the resources will change, will move, will redistribute, what chances are we need to have a tool so that we can better manage sustainably, or at least the information so that people have a chance to manage sustainably. And that's what we've been trying to do in blue communities.
Thank you. Are there any more questions on the floor? Because I can ask many more things for the benefit. Mel and I have been in the group together, but I would like to ask, now there was one again, in your experience, how can local government help to bridge the gap between communities and scientists? And I think this experience, certainly we have gone through many years, understanding the needs between scientists and communities. Everybody have their needs, and sometimes it is a mismatch. But nevertheless, I think one of the point that you highlight was communication, effective communications to pass the message. We speak, the scientists speak the language of communities so that they understand. But in your experience now, I want to hear how do you think that the government can address this gap and assist to make things easier for scientists when they do their work that will benefit communities?
I think it's a really good question, and it's a really difficult one. And what it requires is people with open minds to the value of the science, and that actually the science can help inform. And I think this is why I've got so keen on the whole ecosystem services natural capital approach, because it starts to talk a language that often governments understand, which is there is a value here. There's a value in terms of the economics of the value of the fisheries or the value of the resources in monetary terms. And there's a value because people's health might be affected. There's a value because people care about things. And ultimately, the one that we never really measure is the value in terms of the local government of the people who vote for them. The choices people make in their votes can be dependent on the openness of government. So that's one aspect, and it's why I use ecosystem services. I think, as I say, you need to have politicians and political policymakers, not so much politicians, but policymakers who are open to the idea of talking to scientists. And you need good communicating scientists. And I think we're moving into a new generation of scientists who, as they take these inter and transdisciplinary approaches, interdisciplinary, where we bring different disciplines together, natural sciences, social sciences, medical sciences, physical sciences, but also transdisciplinary. These people are also not only supposed to talk to each other, but also talk to the audience, which is the policymaker, the regulator, and the manager. And I think the more we do interdisciplinary research, the better we become at understanding the importance of that communication. Because unless we can communicate to government in language that they understand, they won't listen. But we also need it to be the other way. The government needs to be prepared to listen and to understand that there is, what is called and has been called an environmental externality in the whole economics and politics and policy that has previously just ignored and assumed and taken for granted that the environment will always be there to underpin everything we do. And now I think through the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, we're beginning to realize that actually we can't take that for granted. And not only is this important for the economics? It might also be important for the way people behave towards voting for and electing future governments as well, and supporting governments. So I think it's that interplay that is important both to governments, government workers, to understand that they're obliged to listen to the scientists, and the scientists that they're obliged to talk to the policymakers and to help the policymakers. It's a two-way thing.
Yeah, I think the pandemic that came across last year globally have somehow lifted the status of scientists providing that possible cure for things like that, and policymakers, decision makers are starting to sit down and listen to the scientists based on hard data. Fantastic. Now, there is a question from the floor that I would like to read. To date, from the efforts and result of the initiative, what would be the possible output that can be pushed to young emerging researchers? This is something like advisory, or basically I'll say something that you would like to leave a message for young researchers coming up based on your experience here, interdisciplinary work, things like that. What would be the possible output that can be pushed to these young people? Thank you.
I think, so for me, I'm so passionate about the need that we do research because we're paid by the public to do research, and not just because it's our hobby and something that's really fascinating to us. And I think it's that if you do research, you're privileged to do something that's actually really quite enjoyable, but you're also obliged to make sure that the research you do is useful to other people. And that means potentially always looking at I've called it the so what question. Why am I doing this? Who's affected by it? What's the importance of what I'm doing, and how do I convey that importance and talk to people about the research that I've done and why it's important to the people that have paid for it? I think, that's a kind of bottom line is, we do stuff, but we should do it for a purpose other than just our own kind of intellectual fascination with it. Intellectual fascination gets us to different places, and I don't want to decry the importance of discovery science, of doing something just because it might lead us somewhere, because that is important. But you also have to have that open mind of, so I'm doing this, it's fascinating. What might be the spin-offs from this? Why might it be important? Not just because it's leading to fundamental discoveries about theory or about different sort of aspects of biodiversity or of life in general, but where might the spin-outs be that other people could use this information?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Are there any more questions? Maybe from the Secretariat? Okay, there. Hold on. There are a lot of large private fishing corporations which have great impact on fish species in the tropics. Is there any research that can influence how these fishing companies conduct their activities?
I think we're sort of working towards that. I mean, there are things that can be done in terms of understanding the impact. I think it's around evidencing the impact of those fisheries. And we're doing that to a certain extent through the ecosystem services approach and thinking about those trade-offs. So if you have a large fleet of fishing vessels coming into your waters, what are the trade-offs with the other people who are affected? That might be the coastal communities who find that that fishery has taken away their local livelihood. And I think this is about equity. That if, and again, that starts to bring in a very social science concept that I think most natural scientists who are fisheries scientists would not traditionally have thought about. They'd have traditionally thought about, is this sustainable? Can we manage this catch? Not necessarily about who else is the catch being taken from that might be dependent upon it. I was struck when I first started the project about how unavailable fish as a food is to local communities because it's so expensive, because it all gets exported. There's a trade-off that goes on there that I think is invisible to the consumers, and I think to a large extent invisible to government and policymakers. And that's where interdisciplinary projects like Blue Communities can raise that awareness of, well, it's great, you maybe get a small revenue from allowing a large fishing fleet into your coastal waters, but what are the trade-offs with the other impacts on the coastal communities, on tourism, on people's other livelihoods, and developing economies locally that might actually support the country better than having kind of small but very exploitive fisheries. It is a tricky one, and I think it happens everywhere. It happens in the UK as well. We have a very, very large small fishing community and a very, very small large fishing community, if you get what I mean. You know, we have a small number of very large boats taking a lot of fish and a large number of very small boats taking not so much fish, and it's really difficult to manage it. It's very inefficient to manage it, but you know, it does need to be managed.
Okay, one last question. Time is almost up, but I think to be fair, posted. Beside enforcement and regulations to keep the marine resource sustainable, how else science and technology can sustain the ecosystem of marine resource? Any particular technology that generates revenue and keep it sustainable at the same time? I believe there are, but let me hear from you if there is one that are in place now.
I think the combination of renewable energy and aquaculture, co-location is one to look for the future. So I think developing renewable energy installations that can provide electricity to coastal communities, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, and there's a lot of work going on in this in the region. But teaming that up with, if you put a structure in the water, or if you have structures, then why not use that for growing seaweed or for growing shellfish, or for, multiple use, trying to combine uses. Those are the technologies I'd probably push to help people with their livelihoods and also solve some of the kind of climate crises of energy. Everybody needs energy. So let's make it, renewable energy, sustainable energy. But at the same time, that also helps to feed people and to provide, a source of income. Yes,
thank you. Okay, we have a few more minutes, but I think it's fair that, are there any words from the Secretariat that before I wrap up this thing on behalf of the organizers?
No last words from us. So I think you can wrap up the session for today.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much, Sufyan. Firstly, I must thank Professor Melanie Austen for supporting this course here that we have, and I think it was a brilliant talk, even though I might have listened it on several occasions. But I think a new insight today being presented virtual, and new findings, new outputs are provided to all of us here. Thank you very much, Mel, for providing us a glimpse of what is happening in the Blue Communities program. And I think, I hope the people who are here would be able to understand it better now that there is a great work being done, supported by the UK government. I must put on record again the UK Research and Innovation, GCRF, for providing the support, without which we will not be together with 4 countries working on some common goals to improve the biodiversity of this region, and most important, health and well-being of the communities. And of course, several new findings. This international conference on tropical science that would be happening next month with the theme of Future Belongs to Tropics. We started with this pre-conference thing to build up the momentum towards that. And hopefully some of you out there would be able to participate and join the conference. I must thank the organizer, Mahathir Science Award Foundations, for inviting me and Prof Melanie to be on board. discussions. And of course, the Academy of Science, where I'm a fellow myself. Thank you for making it possible. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your participation in this talk. I believe the organizer will make things available either online to Facebook, which you can view at any hours. As for the presentations, I wouldn't say much. I will let the organizer and Prof Melanie to discuss that behind the scene. And once again, Mel, thank you very much. All the participants, thank you. Selamat petang and have a nice day. Stay safe to all of you and be good. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you very much, Professor Rahimatsah and also Professor Melanie.
Yeah, bye.